trust the story, that the story isn't over. Because for me, I recognize, okay, the story's not over. So now what? That's like the big question that we have to ask ourselves a lot in life is like, okay, I've been through this, and now what? I felt compelled at this event, even though I'm the drummer, I don't sing, I don't have a microphone, but I felt compelled to get up in the front, get on the microphone, and just tell a little bit of my story. But it was enough to where this young girl like reached out and messaged me and started sharing her story. She shared her struggles
Mhm.
with suicidal thoughts and different things like that. And there was this connection that was made there, and
Mhm.
recognizing like my story by telling it, even if it doesn't always come out right, even if it's imperfect, that's that's nonetheless can be a catalyst for someone else's story to come forward.
Hey everyone, I'm Caroline Marina, and welcome to Awakening Soul Divinity. And today, our guest is Derrick Hatch. And I'm not going to get into anything Derrick does because I'm going to leave that up to Derrick. I'm looking forward and I'm so excited to have this conversation with him because we actually did a podcast together on his channel. No, I don't think it's a YouTube channel though, but we did a
It
podcast.
is. It actually is. Your episode is on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. So you can follow him there. We did an episode. It was 2 years ago or less.
Hmm.
No, it was,
Yeah, it was 2 years ago.
yeah. And that was the time when I was working on my old podcast and I was working through my processes and everything and life and the universe and everything has brought me to this place. And now I get to be in this place again with
The
Derrick.
roles have reversed.
Excited. What was that?
The roles have reversed.
Roles
So
have
now you are
reversed.
the host and I'm the guest.
That's right. But you know what? We could always switch possibilities here. You can ask me questions too, so that's okay.
Yeah.
See, we're
Just
going.
having a conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly, and that's the
Yeah.
intention. I don't like the word interviews. I love the word conversation because it
Me too. Me too.
thoughts and ideas, and here we are. And the first question I want to ask you, I mean, is a basic question. I'd love
Hmm.
to know at this point because I've known you for a while. Tell
Hmm.
everyone about the kind of work that you do.
Sure. So to start, there's a key word that kind of encompasses everything I do, and that's the word narrative,
Mm.
or some people like to say story. So I started a company a few years ago called All Things Narrative. And my heart behind it was to be able to pull together all these different strands, almost like in a postmodern kind of way, because there's all these different conversations that people are having about stories and how they are a part of what makes us human and how stories are involved in meaning making, right? So you've got everything from the ancient stories, right? The myths, the
Mhm.
folklore, the religions, like that are trying to tell these stories to try to make sense of reality. And you've got great thinkers, like Joseph Campbell, like the famous, we talk about the hero's journey, right? On
Yes,
the
yes,
episode you were on with me.
yeah,
And so like how do we kind of understand like these stories and how they connect with our psyche,
yes.
with our being. And so you've got that aspect of story there. And then that traces all the way through history because we've been telling stories as long as we're able to communicate. And now, we live in this time where we tell stories all kinds of ways. We tell stories via books, novels, via movies, TV shows, video games. I mean, even Instagram, you can post a story. Journalism, biographies, these are all different examples of narratives, of stories here, right?
Mhm.
But that's not the only aspect of story. That might be the first aspect we think of story are those things, are those works of fiction and nonfiction that really inspire us. And that's a huge part of what story and narrative is. But there's other aspects of it as well. So you've got thinkers, for example, like like Michael White, who was a therapist, and he and his partner David Epstein, they coined this phrase narrative therapy, and it became a whole field of study. And that's actually what my master's background is in,
Okay.
of how do we understand the stories that we're living, the stories that we're telling ourselves, and how those stories play out in the world. So it's not just storytellers that are out there telling stories that we're entertained and amused by, but what are the stories that we're living out every single day?
Hmm.
And then in addition to that, you've got thinkers more recent like Donald Miller, who really tie that into the story that you're telling, the story you're living, and the story you're creating, right? So he does a lot of work with like businesses and companies, and what is it like to think of what you do as a story, as a brand, of how you're inviting people into a narrative, right? And you're
Hmm.
a guide that's playing a role in their lives in some way.
Hmm.
And then you've got thinkers. I mean, I could keep going on this, right? You've got so many different thinkers and people out there that are trying to make sense of this thing called story, this thing called narrative.
Right.
And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a company that brought all those different things together and let them sit. So this was my thesis project when I was going to school for narrative therapy and community work. And I wanted to try to bring all these different aspects of narrative together and create some sort of experience for people.
Mm.
And it started off as like a 6 week class. You know, I was doing it with young adults, doing it with high school, middle school students. And then it kind of grew and developed. It eventually became like a whole program that I created. And now there's different aspects of it, how it plays out. You know, I've got a class that I teach called the art of storytelling that helps people to learn about storytelling as an art form, how to communicate it, what it means to live a meaningful story, right? I've got coaching that I do now for people who want to get a better sense of their story,
Mm.
one-on-one coaching that works with them on the speaking aspect, the writing aspect of it. And the personal development aspect of it as well, because that's a huge part when you're creating your story. And then on top of that, you know, being able to offer workshops to groups, to organizations, being able to offer events, open mics where people can come here in South Florida and they can get on stage and they can practice telling their stories, right, in a safe environment.
Okay.
Podcasts, yeah, and you know, you've been a part of that. And then podcasts as well, you know, where we can bring both the educational side of what story is, but also at the same time, the way that we want to empower people to think about their life as a story. So that's a bit about of the work that I'm doing there. So I don't know if that answers that question, but
Yeah, pretty fully, I think. And it's interesting. You brought up a few things in my mind because when we spoke last on your podcast, it was related to personal story and
yes.
stories we tell ourselves
Mm-hmm.
from trauma, through trauma,
Mm-hmm.
in life, you know, that, and that fits right in with this narrative therapy. And I didn't
Mm-hmm.
remember
Mm-hmm.
recently until you just said that, that was the degree that you got. And I
Mm-hmm.
find that interesting because, you know, the stories that we live in, especially nowadays from trauma,
Yeah.
are stuck in our subconscious. They're stuck in our
Mm-hmm.
nervous system. So the repetitive
Right.
of the story will also create what happens in our life. When we
Yeah.
continue to think the thing or we speak the thing, that creates. So, how can that story or narrative be changed to
Mm-hmm.
create or co-create a life
Mm-hmm.
that you want to live, as opposed to a life that someone stuck their voice in your head and
Right.
following that narrative, you know?
Yeah, we call that reauthoring, what you just
Okay.
mentioned there. We call that reauthoring because there is a dominant story that, a dominant narrative that tends to dictate a lot of things about the way we see ourselves, that
Mm-hmm.
might influence the way that we move in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that dominant narrative often can be linked to some sort of trauma that we experience, and we
Right.
allow the trauma to say who we are. We allow the trauma to speak on our behalf, right?
Right.
Now, what we want to do in narrative practice is we don't want to minimize what happened, and we don't want to downplay it, and we don't want to ignore and act like it didn't happen and just find a new narrative and move on, right? what we have to do instead is we have to recognize that that narrative exists, but it's not the only story, right? It's not the only way that we're defined. So part of the reauthoring conversations that we have is how do we unearth maybe what might be implicit in the narrative, but might be absent in our minds. So, for example, this could include everything from, ways that we were able to cope with our suffering,
Mm,
ways that we were able to find skills to survive, ways that we were able to connect with meaning. And that was another thing I didn't share earlier, but like Viktor Frankl, he has a wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning.
yes.
And that's another aspect of story as well, is how do we make meaning in life? How
Even
do
out of the
we,
worst thing, the worst possible
yes,
things. That's a
yes.
suggestion in and of itself, especially with what's going on in the world. Read that.
Absolutely. So yeah, so that's a huge part of the piece of the puzzle here is when we are trying to reauthor and trying to figure out what's the story that I want to live out moving forward, even if I've been through all this. I mean, I highly recommend if you haven't read that book to read it to any of your listeners out there, because that is like, I mean, it doesn't get much more traumatic than what he
No,
went through and
no.
what they went through in those camps in the Holocaust.
Hmm.
But the way that at the same time you're able to see that there's these moments where he's able to find something to hang on to, where he's able to figure out what keeps him going, right? And he talks about that all we need is we need that little seed of hope. We need something, some sort of like narrative that's going to get us past it, right? Whether you're anchored to, the narrative of your religious, of your spiritual beliefs, whether you're anchored to the narrative of what you're going to do once you get out, right? So he talked about like how he imagined that he was going to be like in a room with people, that he was going to be speaking about these experiences, talking about what it means to be human, talking about what eventually became his field, which is logotherapy. I think that's what it's called. We had a vision, right? And that's what
Yeah.
sustained him. And we have to be intentional. So this is a part of narrative practice as well as what are called intentional states. We
Yes.
have to really lean on these things that we have control over, because there's a lot of things in life that we don't. But we do have control over, for example, what are my values going to be, the things that I'm going to not compromise on, that I'm going to hold on to no matter how hard life gets. What are the beliefs that I stand on, that are the rock and the foundation, that even when the storms of life come crashing in, these things might get shaken, right? I mean, that's definitely happened for me. But how do we at the same time find those things and keep going? Your sense of purpose,
Well,
different skills, knowledge that you have, your desires, like all of these things are things we have to decide for ourselves. And ultimately the commitment of who am I going to be in the situation?
and one of the things in that, what you just said, for me, it took a lot of nervous system healing to even get to the point
Mm,
where I could do that. So,
mm-hmm.
as a highly sensitive person, I realized or I found out that my high sensitivity is 26 out of 27 traits.
Wow.
So I can feel everything, and of course I'm an empath as well.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us who are both, and especially high with a high sensitivity, when a trauma happens, it kind of stay for at least for me, I can speak, it kind of stays stuck in the nervous system until there is something that you're either willing to do
Mm-hmm.
or that you are forced to do,
Right.
get you into the healing process to come out of that to even get to what you're talking about. Because until I
Mm-hmm.
was able to do that, now I don't know entirely of what your story is, but I will be asking a
Mm-hmm.
similar question. But in that, it's like it took me a lot of dark nights of the soul
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
somatic healing in the body, not just thinking
Mm-hmm.
about it or telling myself. I mean, I could tell myself over and over again, I'm happy, I've got plenty of money, I've got
Mm-hmm.
this, I've got, the what do they call that, the affirmation thing. Well, the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
affirmations work, but if there's nothing inside that you can attach them to because you feel terrible about yourself, you don't feel
Mm-hmm.
good enough, you don't feel any of that stuff, those affirmations don't necessarily work. and those stories that the new stories you're working on replacing won't catch at the beginning.
Right, right.
Got to release that emotion that's been trapped in your body, whether it's anger or fear or whatever that looks like. And
Hmm.
story helps because you hear from other people. That's why I love, like you had mentioned about the education and the conversational piece, which is an
Hmm.
empowerment of that. That's what I love about this setup, is because
Yeah,
I want to present people like you who have been through and are doing to help something in relation to that, which educates and
right.
empowers people. And I think it's important because that will also help. Like, for example, even with everything that I had been through, I was also listening to motivational speakers a couple of years ago or 40 years ago. And that pushed me right over. It helped, but then I kept falling back into holes again. So that wasn't such a help. And then it's interesting. I want to touch on what you said about Viktor Frankl. Uh,
Hmm.
in my world, I've got numerous or various types of trauma:
Hmm.
childhood, military sexual trauma,
Hmm.
generational trauma from the Holocaust. So when you brought him
Hmm.
up, it
Hmm.
was like, and I've read the book, and it was so empowering for me
Yeah.
because that is the worst of the worst of the worst of what a human being could go through.
Hmm.
And I have a direct connection in my DNA with that. And I had to even work through that piece of it from someone
Hmm.
else's experience. And not in the camps, maybe in the camps. I'm a kid because a part of my family had that experience. But
Yeah.
just to be able to retell the story and to change the synapses in our brains to go a different
Hmm.
way, it's like there's so many things we could tell ourselves because we don't feel good enough, because we were programmed to feel not good enough, that we
Hmm.
keep telling ourselves these stories, or we're reiterating the stories that we heard from people in our lives,
Right.
our parents or the educate or school, or even religions, or I've had that experience before. And
Hmm.
anything outside of ourselves should not be telling us. It's our story, and
Hmm.
we choose how we get to change that story.
Yeah.
Sound right? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we have these things in life that are yours.
Mm-hmm.
They are uniquely yours. Your story is one of those things. And we don't always think of it like that. We kind of go, "Oh yeah, yeah, I've got a story or I've got stories I could tell you for ages, right?" But
Right.
when we begin to take ownership
Mm-hmm.
of these things and we go, "Wow, like no one has a story quite like mine." We have patterns and we have things that we connect with that we bond over as human beings, but it never ceases to amaze me how unique
Okay,
every
can you use
single
that word?
person's
Yes.
life is, right? Because every story is going to have its own twists and turns and
Yeah.
bumps and highs and lows and all those different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I love to do is give people clarity.
Yes.
I don't want people to be lost in the dark about what story their life is telling. Some
Mm-hmm.
people might have a certain limited perspective of what that story is. They might see, for example, one that I've seen is like the victim mentality, where you just see yourself as a victim in everything in life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more to the story than that. I mean, again, like if you look at these memoirs and accounts of Holocaust survivors, they don't stay trapped. In fact, Viktor Frankl warns of staying trapped in that mentality, right? Of how it limits you in many ways. And so being able to see and have an honest relationship with your story, because I think sometimes we might be afraid to face our story.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we might not think our story is worth saying. I mean, I get that a lot. Like, oh, I don't really have an interesting story. I don't really have a story to tell. Can't tell you how many times I hear that.
I'm sure.
And being able to, you even have to change the narrative about the narrative. That is part of the work there, is
Yeah.
being able to have a relationship with your story. But then, once you begin to have this sense of narrative of what you're telling yourself, and you're conscious of it, because you're doing it unconsciously, but
Mm-hmm.
if you begin to be conscious of what that is, then it starts to impact the way that you talk about that narrative with other people. And
Right.
then, it talks about how, like, the way that you you move, you're going to move. And I mean, there's a lot of neuroscience that can back this up as well. But it's like when you have a goal, when you have something that you put your mind to and you focus on it, your brain is going to try to figure out ways to make that goal happen, right? And so with a story, if there's a particular story of something that you want in life, then your brain is going to try to figure out like how do I bring that about?
Can I have something because you hit something with that. Like
Yeah.
just as an example from my experience, that's 100% exactly the way that worked for me
Hmm.
because of my trauma from the generational trauma
Hmm.
that was wrapped up in lack because
Mm.
my grandparents, the Nazis and the SS came in and took their money out of their banks. They took their home. They took everything. They were in Prague when World War II started. And they
Mm.
had to escape Prague and went to Israel, which was uh, Palestine at that time,
Hmm. Hmm.
and in 1938. And they had to escape all that. But it was backtracked when I did all my work on myself to money. And I'm
Mm.
carrying this lack for years. And it's like the lack, it feeds into every part
Hmm.
of life for in my experience.
Hmm.
And as I healed that out of my nervous system, I got to the point where, I kept hearing, you know, oh, well, you need to do this, start your group, and go through that process. And then, oh, well, now you like doing podcasts, huh? Well, go ahead and start the podcast now.
Yeah.
The minute I started to focus on what I wanted within that podcast, because I loved doing
Hmm.
it, a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
that's when things started clicking. And it was like, and I've always been a person who goes after something, but as I was walking through all these things coming up for me, it stopped me.
Yeah.
Once I brought that back in, it was another interesting thing was I talked to a medium and I interviewed her too. And one of the things that came through was this random guy who another medium had told me was the same person who said, when you put your mind to something, you can make things happen.
Hmm.
And I had forgotten about that. And the minute
Hmm.
I heard that, I was like, oh, I know what I got to, and that's the thing. But sometimes we have to be reminded of things that we forgot.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going through the process
Hmm.
of the response or reaction to the trauma or whatever's going on. So from lack to the desire, like I'm not making any money off of the podcast at the moment,
Hmm.
but it led me to the point where I can have these conversations where people can join and it can bring, like, I look at money as an energy now. I don't look at it
Hmm.
as something I've got, that
Hmm.
like I used to. So
Hmm.
there's these pieces of that mentioned just a few minutes ago. I could feel that deeply in my process,
Yeah.
yeah. So let me ask you this question.
Hmm.
When you talk about these things that you've just mentioned, how
Hmm.
do you see it relating to the awakening that is going on with people right now and what's going on in the world? Because what I feel like there's some connection, especially when we own our story and are willing to
Hmm.
change our story. And one of those things that you were talking about that we have innately that nobody can take away from us is choice.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's interesting to me to ask that question to see how you see that relation to the awakening into what's happening in the world at the moment.
Yeah. So I'm not sure, like when we talk about an awakening, I'm not sure like what aspect of an awakening, like what your definition is of that. But I could share a little bit about what I see with it.
Well, let me share my
Yeah,
definition
yeah,
because that's part of what this podcast is about. So the
yeah.
awakening is an awakening to our humanness,
Yeah. Mm,
humanity, who
hmm.
we uncovering the truth of who we really are. And what that
Yeah.
in my mind and world is love. It
Hmm.
all we're like a fractal of God. We're a fractal of unconditional love. So the
Hmm.
awakening is opening us up into self-love.
Okay.
Yeah. So
So I think what you're describing about like awakening to our humanness, right? So I remember years ago, so I have two degrees. So I have a master's degree in narrative therapy from, a school, the University of Melbourne in Australia, which, is more of like a liberal kind of school, right?
Yep.
And then I have a bachelor's degree in ministry from like a very like conservative Christian school.
Okay.
And I love that my experience isn't being in both these worlds because I think that we're losing the art of connection as human beings
Mhm.
because we're tending to fall into these silos and we're trying to almost like in a tribal way and really kind of holding onto our tribe, our silo, and lashing out at the other, right?
Mhm.
And I love that I've gotten to be in these different spaces and I've gotten to see like what are the different pieces that each space brings to the table, right? And
Yes.
so like for me, like my personal like awakening like in terms of that humanness that you're describing comes in seeing these things together, right? Seeing that we're not enemies. Like our fight and our battle is not against each other and being able to see that we're in this together as human beings.
Yes.
um and so what does it mean to be a human being in 2024 and beyond,
Mhm.
right? And I think we're at a time where, we have a lot of hindsight, we have a lot of context, we have a lot of things that we can look back on and try to say, like, okay, well, we don't want this, or we want more of this for our lives,
Oh, so learning
right?
history.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm a proponent of that all day. Absolutely. We need to know our history.
Uh-huh.
And we're also, I think, in a moment where we're waking up to what kind of world are we really living in? We're living in a world where there's other people that are making decisions
Mhm.
that affect our lives every single day. There's wars that are being fought right now and being, like even just today as like we're filming or this podcast, right? And just the way that Russia, Ukraine is heating up, like all these things are like out of our control. We
Mhm.
have, people in different industries that are deciding, what goes into our medication, what goes into our food, what goes into all these different things, right? And so it could be so hard as a human being to go, where's my agency in this?
Right. Yeah.
It feels like everything is spiraling out of control. What can I do, right? And I think what we're waking up to is recognizing, well, what can I do?
Hmm.
I have more agency than I think I do. I think we all do. And I think narrative and story is such a key aspect of that. Can I give you like an example? Like a film example, because I love movies. It's a big part of the podcast that I do.
Absolutely.
But I was watching this recently with my dad. One of my favorite films is a movie. I don't know if you've seen it. Blade Runner 2049.
Probably not, because if it's got any like uh the action, probably an action
Sure.
movie and there's
It's
some,
like sci-fi, yeah, like
yeah,
sci-fi
so
action.
probably not. But go ahead.
So here's what's really cool about this. Maybe your listeners have seen this movie, but it's about like the main character is technically like not a human being. It's like they're these creatures that they look like beings and everything like that, but they're created almost like a combination of like AI and like robot, like all that kind of stuff, but they're programmed ultimately to be obedient like to humans, right? So
Mm,
the story of like Blade Runner 2049, it takes the like Pinocchio story of like what does it mean to like become a real boy, and it turns it into the story of what does it mean to become like a full like human being, right? And so it's the story of somebody who is on the journey of becoming human, but there's certain things they need to go through, right? And they're trying to figure out their identity and they're trying to figure out where they have agency there. And it's a beautiful story. I don't think I'm going to spoil it here, but ultimately, where the story heads is a story of the main character realizing that there is a conflict bigger than them that they are just caught up in.
mhm,
And they're being pulled in all these different directions of what to do by different factions. And he is able to push past that and figure out what can I do? And the answer is what you shared earlier, and it's that love. And the decision that he makes is a decision that's ultimately based on love because it has to do with reuniting a father and a daughter who have been separated from each other, right?
Mhm.
And so his answer to what does it mean to be a human being is I want to press in with my agency to how can I bring about the most love? And that's what he does, right? He makes a decision that brings that reunites these people together who have been separated for so long.
Mhm.
And so I think with us, when we think of the story we want to live, we think about, okay, like when it comes to this realization we've had that love, like you go back to the 60s, right? Where you go, to all you need is love. But yeah, but you even go all the way back to like the biblical tradition, and you see like these beautiful passages about what love is, right? Like love is patient, love is kind. Like you see that we've been wrestling for thousands of years as human beings, but we're starting to realize like what does it mean to fully give ourselves in love, to care for ourselves, to care for other people, right? What
Mhm.
does it mean to give of ourselves to, like spouses, to those of us who are raising children, to loving our neighbor, right? All these different things. And so, I mean, there's such a beauty in that because despite how chaotic the world feels, we're recognizing that we do have agency and we're recognizing that love is the answer to move forward.
Yeah, and thank you because that's a very powerful statement. And in that, the question comes up I'm hearing from people, is, well, how do I do that? Because you can't just
Hmm.
automatically have love for yourself and then go change the world.
Yeah.
There are pieces of it. I mean, there you find that way, you
Hmm.
meditate, you walk in nature, you ground yourself on the earth and exchange the energies with Mother Earth. And, there's so many different ways to create peace in your life so you can get rid of the noise and connect with that love inside of yourself. For me, it was a research project. So in the space of finding that love within ourselves, it's a choice. And like for me, it was a project. Like I would find things and
Hmm.
like what was the cognitive therapy was the first thing. And
Hmm.
when that stopped working, then I moved into somatic therapy. When that stopped working, I moved into research. Well, actually, I started here with researching different religions and trying to figure that piece out. And, when I researched that, I came back to love. Everything I did came back to love. Everything I
Hmm.
did came back to who I am inside of myself. And you
Hmm.
were saying something about, healing the world. What's interesting that I've also discovered in that is that it's not healing ourselves is the main thing that we do first.
Hmm.
Then it's one heart at a time. It's
Hmm.
not like you can't, once you do that, it's too overwhelming to want to go out into the world and just, okay, everybody's healed. That's impossible.
Right.
It's really
Right.
impossible, right?
Hmm.
So by healing yourself first and then
Hmm.
creating a space for someone else to,
Hmm.
and then
Yeah.
talking and having the conversations and recreating narratives,
Yeah.
the moments that every time, I think you're too young to remember this commercial. I can't, I think it was like in the 70s, late 70s,
Okay.
early 80s or something like that. And
Hmm.
you probably weren't even born yet, were you?
Nope.
Nah, okay. So it's a Fabergé Organics commercial, and what it was a shampoo. And
Mm.
basically, this woman comes on and she's talking about the shampoo, saying how wonderful it is, whatever. And then she says, and I told two friends, and she told two friends, and so on and so on and so on.
Mm.
And to me, that relates back to story, that relates back to narrative, and it relates back to how we do the thing first. We create the love in ourselves first, and then we shine that light. And then
Hmm.
two friends are like, well, what did you do? And then you tell
Hmm.
them. So
Hmm.
they do it. And then they tell
Right.
friend. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting analogy as to how even a Fabergé Organics commercial works in relation to being human. I mean, every
Hmm. Of course.
life is something that we can relate to if we're paying
Absolutely.
to it.
Hmm.
And it all comes back to love.
We live in a time where love, that word can get really watered down in our culture. We could say, like, I love you. I love pizza, like all these things. And it's just like, okay, what does that really mean, right? Like if I'm going to say like I love you, like what does that really mean? And I think one of the best definitions I think I've ever heard of love is that love is a commitment to be with someone and for someone towards their betterment. And I love that because it emphasizes that love is not just a flippant thing that we do. We are committing to something, right? We're committing to people. We want to be alongside them, with them as they're journeying through whatever it is they're going through in life. But we also want to be for their betterment, right? We want to be their advocate. We want to be somebody who's cheering them on, somebody who's encouraging and supporting them, right? Sometimes to be for them, we have to have hard conversations. Sometimes we have to be able to face reality and not run away from it. But ultimately, you're doing that because you love them, right? So to me, there's an aspect of love that when we press into it, when we really, really press into that with people, and that's what I love about your like your Facebook group that you have, the Old Souls, Highly Sensitives, Empaths Facebook group, which I mean, kudos to you for how much that's grown. Like that's remarkable, right?
Yeah.
Because I think what you're communicating there is you're speaking to that need that we have as human beings to love. And, as empaths, like highly sensitive people, you you can pick up on when it's phony, when
Mm,
it's superficial, right? When it's not authentic or genuine. And I think that's a part of this awakening too I'm seeing
mm,
is that people are craving authenticity, that we really want what's real. We're
yes.
tired of being sold a narrative,
Yeah.
right? A certain kind of narrative. We want a narrative and a story that's authentic and true to who we're created to be.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think that's part of the most important thing that's going on at this point in the world. I mean, there's just so much challenge to work
Hmm.
through. And
Yeah.
have that would be a space where now I'm looking at the whole big picture, being the empath, highly sensitive. I'm like, what is that? I forget the name of it, but everything's beautiful and everything's love and there's a word for that and I can't really think of it right now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, because that's what it could lead to that if we
Mm-hmm.
choose to do this process
Right.
and find that love within ourselves, with each other, uh, you know, higher power, Mother
Mm-hmm.
Earth. So the connection is all there. So how do you see the changes in what's happening
Mm-hmm.
related to how we can heal through story, and why do we need?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll kind of share a little bit about my experience. And I think I've told you this story. We might have even discussed this on my podcast, but we have these different kinds of traumas that we can experience in life.
Mm-hmm.
So one that was really significant for me was when I was 16 years old and I was driving a car home from school, and it was me and my brother in the car, and I was turning on a right, like in a right-hand turn, but I immediately went into the left-hand lane. And I didn't see that there was actually another car that was coming down the road at the time, probably about 45, maybe 50 miles per hour. It was coming down and it actually like rammed into my car, and my car, like it was like, imagine like your car getting like pushed, right? Getting pushed off, and I had to swerve the wheel. I mean, it all happened so fast, but I had to swerve the wheel because I could feel the impact of the other car, right? And I had to swerve it, and that brought us off the road. And there was like a line of like oak trees like on the side of the road, and so we hit one of the oak trees and it went through the windshield of the car.
Oh, wow.
So the first thing about this story that's crazy is that the car was completely totaled and destroyed, but both my brother and I crawled out of the car because we had to climb out. Um, we climbed out of the car completely, like physically unharmed.
Wow.
At least from what we could tell. I actually do think later, you know, once I've learned more about how trauma stays in the body, right? And
Yeah.
the back problems and different difficulties I've had, I was like, oh, I actually think I did have something happen, right, in my
Yeah.
body there. But
There's
at
a
the time,
response.
there
Yes.
was nothing that I could have like gone to the emergency room
Yeah.
or anything
Well, it's
like
like
that for.
whiplash. It's like whiplash. Whiplash
Uh-huh.
really doesn't show up for a few days sometimes.
Right.
You
Right.
could have done it,
Yeah.
you don't know in the moment because your adrenaline's so kicked up. You
Yeah.
paying attention to that. Yeah. So that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so what was happening was that that moment was that was an awakening for me. Or I like to actually call that more like in stories, you know, you have this moment called like a catalyst conflict.
That's
Like yeah, you're familiar with that idea where basically we have some sort of like catalyst that sparks something
yeah.
that we go, okay, I'm on a journey towards something, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what
There's
I was gonna say is
yeah,
the story, the catalyst, why you're doing the work that you're doing
yes,
now,
exactly.
how you see the changes with that work in the world related to do using the story to heal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that moment was huge for me because I didn't really think my life had much value or meaning at that time in my life, you know?
How old were you?
16. So I
Oh,
was going through like just typical like teenage angst. You know, you get bullied, you got breakups, you got like all these different things that you're navigating, right? And you're trying to figure out who you are and you're wrestling with your identity. So it's like it's not like what I'm sharing is like foreign to the human experience.
right,
It's
right.
it's a part of our coming of age. But if we're honest, I think sometimes when we're wrestling through our identity, we can get to this place where we start to wonder if we even matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I was at when that accident happened. But then I started to think differently. And it wasn't like an overnight thing, but it was a seed that began to be nurtured at that point where I started to recognize, okay, I'm here. That would have really sucked if like I would have lost my ability. Like, I don't know, like I would have lost an arm. Like I'm a drummer. That would have sucked to lose that or my brain, my mind, right? If something happened there. And I started realizing, man, I appreciate this. I appreciate what I got here.
Yeah.
And even just like, you know, like, when you're young, you listen to like music a lot. And I realized that I was listening to a lot of music intentionally to try to keep me in this perpetual state
Mm-hmm.
of feeling like sad and depressed and all that. There's a time where you can connect with that, but there's also like when you push it too far and you're like, this is all I'm in, is this. And I was just like, like so many like things of just like, oh my gosh, like the music I listened to. What if I listened to music that was more hopeful, that was more
Right.
positive? And then like I'll never forget like a day because I used to like I hated my hair, like absolutely hated my hair. And I know a lot of people go, why? And I'm like, well, you don't have to deal with it. But
Exactly.
but um what I would do is, and this is like a huge metaphor for like my identity, was like I would take a straightening iron and I would like straighten out the curls in my hair because I didn't like the curls and the waviness of my hair. I wanted it to be straight. And so, but there would be times when I would do that. Yeah, you see me. I feel seen. Thank you. And there would be times when I would do that though to kind of get a little darker here. But as I was doing that, I would also put the iron on my own skin and
Mm.
I would let that burn. And it was like, what was going on? And I was like, oh my gosh, it was like a huge identity thing because I was waking up at 5 in the morning to try to make myself look like something that I wasn't, dyeing my hair to make myself look like something I wasn't. And the car accident kind of like, I started to, in the months afterward, I kind of started to move away from that thinking. And I'll never forget like a day when I was like in the bathroom in the morning. I woke up early and I was going to do that. And I was like, I put some music on and I was listening to it. And I was just like, I could choose to be thankful today for what I have. I can choose joy
Mhm.
because there's a lot to be joyful about in life, you know? And I started to realize like, oh my gosh, like I can decide this. I don't have to let other people decide who I am and how I think about myself. And so and a huge aspect of that as well is awakening to the love of God, right? Awakening to the fact that like I don't have to carry all this on my own. You know, like for me and my beliefs is I believe that like God is that love that is with us and for us. And that's a huge part of the journey that I've had to learn is like, okay, God is with me as I'm navigating my identity. He's with me in through this car accident and all the trauma, right? And then because there was a whole like mental aspect of it where I was afraid to drive and, just like living in fear, right? And being able to recognize like God doesn't give up. He's not going to give up on me. Even when I feel tempted to give up on
That's
myself.
right. I
And
know.
that's
I know.
and that love like really propelled me forward in so many ways.
Yeah.
And then
May I share something
yeah,
here?
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
That love in two words in my life is what
Hmm.
that love is. When you say that, keep going. Keep going.
Yeah, yeah,
Always, every time I ask God or the universe, I'm like, okay, so what's my next thing or whatever? Or
yeah,
I don't know what to do. What's my next thing? Whatever
yeah,
state I'm in, it's
yeah.
always keep
Do
going.
do
Keep
the next right thing you can do.
and trust the process.
Hmm. Yeah,
Faith and trust,
right.
going, love, all of it. It's all,
A- ab-
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
And with that, to kind of build off that a bit, trust the story that the story isn't over. Because for me, I recognize, okay, the story's not over. So now what? That's like the big question that we have to ask ourselves a lot in life is like, okay, I've been through this and now what? And so one of the things that I was really active in was like, I was in music, I was drummer, part of bands, and I was like, man, like, what if I could like, I was already like on this kick of writing like more positive, hopeful songs, but I really started to become more intentional about it
Mhm.
after this point. And I remember like I did this event, we did this like they have like these like red ribbon weeks, like say no to drugs, like that kind of thing in schools. And we played at a local school. And I felt compelled at this event, even though I'm the drummer, I don't sing, I don't have a microphone, but I felt compelled to get up in the front, get on the microphone, and just tell a little bit of my story.
Mhm.
Coming from this perspective of like, I don't really have a story worth telling, but I get there and I tell the story, right? I just talk about different things that I had gone through and stuff like that. Nothing big, but it was enough to where this young girl like reached out and messaged me and started sharing her story. She shared her struggles
Mhm.
with suicidal thoughts and different things like that. And there was this connection that was made there and
Mhm.
recognizing like my story by telling it even if it doesn't always come out right, even if it's imperfect, um, that's that's nonetheless can be a catalyst for someone else's story to come forward.
Well, that's why it
And
matters. That's why it matters
yeah,
to tell your story and not keep it locked up inside of you, because you're going to touch on somebody, even if it's one person.
right. Even if it's one person.
Yeah.
And for me, that's all it was. It was one person. And then I was like, how do I create spaces where people could tell their stories? And then I started getting into speaking, right? And then when I started getting into like ministry and like, you're like preparing these sermons, which are basically like talks you're giving, right? It's like teaching and talks, and you're intertwining your story in it, and you're trying to make sense of it in light of what you're learning, in light of faith. And then before you know it, I start to realize, oh my gosh, like I'm in the business of storytelling and the telling. We say this in narrative practice, like the telling and receiving of stories.
Mhm.
So we tell our stories, we receive the stories of others, and there's like this sacred like exchange that's given there
And
when we
that's what's
do that.
happening here. Yes, yes, thank
Yeah, and that's what I think people are waking up to is like there is a power in being able
yes,
to tell our stories and
yes.
receive the stories of others. And to go back to what I shared earlier in the conversation, right? That I think is what's going to heal a lot of this division that we have, a lot of this like isolation, polarization that we're experiencing is we have to listen. We have to listen to each other's stories. We
Mhm.
have to take the time to, even if the stories don't align entirely with where we're at, even if they don't entirely, if we agree with how the conclusions they come up to, we need to recognize that that story um, is how we're trying to make sense of things. It's how we're trying to ultimately chase after some sort of meaning in life. And so working through that trauma of that accident, right? Being able to reauthor my life. Everything that I talk about that I do with clients, I had to do for myself. And it took me from 16 to, I would say, about like 29, like 29, 30 years old. Like, I was all that time when I was working through different pieces of not just that trauma, but other things as well.
Mhm.
And recognizing that I don't have to live in, I was limited by a narrative of, like, I'm a bad driver. I'm a horrible person. Like, I always screw up, like all these different things, to lots of amazing people in my life, like my wife, who came alongside and challenged those narratives.
Mm.
And then the narrative of, like, okay, like, I am a driver. I've made some mistakes, but I'm not defined by my driving record. I'm not defined by my insurance rate going up. I'm not defined by all these things that might tend to say who I am. But I know who I am. I'm a child of God. I'm created in the image of God. Like, there are things that are so much higher than what we tend to sit in for our identity. And that's the journey that I've been in. And once I recognize that story is that universal piece that we all, as human beings, it's what makes us human, the ability to tell stories. It's something that we all have in common, is we all are influenced and shaped by stories. We're all telling and living out stories. Once I realized that that was it, that that's really the glue that can really bring us together, that's why I really wanted to lean into that more. And all these different aspects of things that I've been a part of and I'm interested in, they really started to converge around that. And that's what led to me, like, starting All Things Narrative. And got to tell you, I've never felt more freer in my whole life.
Absolutely.
Free, because I feel like I'm living the story that all these different pieces have been converging towards. But it took agency, right? It took a lot of intentionality to move to this place where I'm living in a story where I can have this lifestyle of how I work, being an entrepreneur, right? Being heavily involved in my church, like all these different things that I've wanted to do in different capacities. And now being able to do that and figure out, how am I going to make this work? And really, like, narrative is the glue that really holds it all together for me.
You know, I have to ask you, and I think I've asked you before, but I can't remember, and it's been too long,
Yeah.
so I can't remember anyway. How old are you at this point?
Well, by the time your listeners hear this episode, I'll be 33.
33. Okay, well, so you've been going through a big shift anyway over the last few years in that
Yeah.
age range. Yeah. What warms my heart and gives me hope
Mm.
is, from my generation to yours, is
Mm-hmm.
that things are shifting.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell by the way you talk. I can tell by, like, most of the people I hang out with or talk to are not. I have a few friends who are my age,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I'm not. It doesn't matter because I say my age all the time, but
Yeah.
I just turned 60 in August. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't like being in that old mindset. There are a few friends of mine who aren't in that old mindset or feeling old. I mean, people your
Mm-hmm.
age can feel old too, but it's what
Mm-hmm.
I'm noticing is the shifts. And I've talked to other people on this podcast about that, is the shift of the generations as we go down. Each
Mm-hmm.
generation is more aware and can figure these things out sooner
Mm.
than most people in my generation, because even like the generation before mine, oh, they were pretty like, this is the way things are and that's it, and you're seeing that mirrored in the world right now, and
Yeah.
changing it, and this is the way it's going to be, and there's no open my mind or my eyes to anything else. And to
Yeah.
have you say it the way you said that was like, yay, there's another one. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's proof to us that there's hope, there's
Yeah.
ability. And the more we in the older generation, like the way I see myself is more as like of a guide
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
younger generation uh to find whatever blind spots that they have. But you already know the answers, you already have all that within you. It's just finding those pieces that are like, oh, I didn't think
Hmm.
about that, you know, and then
Yeah.
that pushes you on your trajectory like
Right.
crazy when you
Yeah.
wake up to something, it's so different than my
Yeah.
generation. Yeah.
It's
So
interesting. I mean, I appreciate you sharing that because for me, like, there's there's an irony because like when you talk about something like narrative therapy, and that's like a very like postmodern idea on like postmodern take on therapy, right? But the irony I see in it is that like narrative is like that's like the most ancient thing that we can get back to, right?
right.
You know, like I'm like I'm a part of like a faith that's like 2000 years old, you know, like as
Probably
like
older.
as a Christian. And it goes back even older because the roots of Judaism, right?
Yeah.
So that, and you know, I've jokingly, but I actually kind of am
Hang,
serious about
hang,
it, have said
hang
like
on just
I'm,
one second, because you can even go older than that. You can go into Egypt. You can go into
yeah,
all,
yeah, yeah, sure.
yeah, yeah. So it's like, how
Yeah.
old are these things really?
Right. These ideas. Yeah.
And they're coming.
Well, and like I've said this kind of jokingly, but I actually, you know, I do mean it as like I see myself as like an old soul, you know, like I'm so in awe and just I love like, you know, many things that I think we can be that we could lose sight of today. You know, I'm like in a lot of ways I'm like a fairly conservative person, but at the same time, what do we do with it now? Where are we heading? Where are we what are we moving towards? What are we journeying towards, right? And I think, you know, kind of like what you're sharing here, I think that's what that's what I'm seeing a lot too is like we're getting back to like these older ancient things, but we're moving somewhere with them. You know, we're recognizing like the time that we're in, and we're starting to see like this the just the significance of to talk about story, right? We're seeing the significance of why narrative, because it's almost been like a taken for granted thing, you
Mhm.
know? But the actual like study of like the science and art of storytelling, you know, that's something that's fairly recent that we're actually like really like unearthing the psychological significance of it, right? The Storytelling Animals, a phenomenal book. I can't recommend enough that gets into that. And so with that, I think is going to come. There's so much hope that's on the horizon. You know, if we want to pursue that, if we want to go after that, I really do. Uh, I see that there, but there's a lot of things that you know. There's a lot of narratives, a lot of discourses that we have to address. Because if we don't address them, it's going to hinder us from moving in that direction.
It's interesting that you bring this topic up because I've been reading a book and I can't remember the name of the book right now, but what he does is he talks about all of the structures that have been built on the planet by ancient civilizations.
Hmm.
And the things that they've found within the structures are stories and guidelines
Hmm.
of how to move forward into the future
Yeah.
and heal all this stuff and do the work and whatever that is. And it's like when we were taught in school and in life and society, we were taught a certain way to conform to society, and that became our programming.
Hmm.
There's information out there, as has been for eons, thousands, tens of thousands of years, that they're pulling this information. And I'm not going to get into, there's, for example, I don't get into this stuff because I don't know enough about it, but the Vatican has been holding all of this information within their uh,
Mm.
catacombs, whatever they
Hmm.
call that,
Hmm.
underneath the Vatican. And
Hmm.
apparently they own some land in the Midwest here in the
Mm.
United States that holds more stuff. It's almost like they didn't want us to know about this information because it was
Hmm.
already there. These indigenous peoples, that the ones that connected the earth with the sky, and and use these, for example, the pyramids in Giza and that
Hmm.
sort of thing. And they've got, like, they're showing pictures of all these, like the triangle, and finding different buildings that they built. Like they built this in 10,000 BC, but then they
Mm-hmm.
built a whole nother thing with the new
Mm-hmm.
understanding on top of that. And then they built another thing on top of it with a new, because these are power places that they built these things up. Stonehenge and,
Mm-hmm.
wherever
Mm-hmm.
they've got things in all over the world. I mean, even in Sedona, Arizona, they're even in this country, for example, they found pyramids in this country. I don't know where they are. I can't speak to that.
Sure.
But it's interesting that what not only when they start doing the archaeology and they go into these places and they're finding the narrative from
Mm-hmm.
that time frame
Right.
actually speaks to where we are now and
Mm-hmm.
how we can move forward at this point. It's like a roadmap. It's
Yeah.
telling us what we need to do, and it fits right into everything that's going on. It's
Yeah.
the craziest thing. And I'm like not even a third of the way into the book. And I'm like, oh my God. So there are things
Yeah.
out there that are, but most of us don't know it. Most of us
Yeah.
know it because they don't want us to know it. And so,
Yeah.
but we can still find it within ourselves.
Yeah.
And
And
that,
within like my tradition, I always say to like my fellow like Christians, I say like we're always like catching up like to Jesus, because like Jesus 2000 years ago, his teachings were so radical at the time, and they still are, like, just like even like in America, like this idea where like Jesus talks about the man who like is doing all the right things, but he's not willing to let go of his possessions. He's holding on to them. And Jesus says, like, if you sell those things, if you let those things go, you're going to find life, right? And it's like, that's so hard, like in the West, in our materialism, to like really let go of these things because we think they're like define us, right? We define ourselves by, the things that we own in a lot of ways.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
we're always like catching up, like anyone who ever has the idea that the ancient like cultures and civilizations were just these barbarians who didn't know anything, like it's ridiculous. You
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
really gotta, like all the different like traditions and different groups, like it's just phenomenal, like the things that we can learn, right? And the things that, we're catching up in a sense.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
because there's definitely like a narrative that came with the enlightenment of like, oh well, now that we have science and rationality, we don't need these things anymore.
Right. Yeah. Stuck with
And
it.
I think we've been realizing in the last 50 years that we've reached the end of the era of modernity, right? Of the enlightenment, where we just think that the answer is going to just be like in the material.
Yeah.
We now see, and I think this is another part of the awakening, is that there is more beyond what we see, right? And
Absolutely.
regardless of where you fall in like a religious or like a spiritual tradition, I think a lot of people are starting to wake up, and they're able to see that there is more beyond this. And
Hmm.
I think that also ties into just the in general, especially in a post-COVID world where we're trying to find what is meaningful and
But
what
it's
is
in here.
true.
But it's in here. It's not out there. It's not in our
Like,
possessions. It's not.
isn't it awesome that like even like Jesus had said, like the kingdom of God is within you,
Okay.
right?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. But this
Right?
could be a whole nother discussion, but yes, 100%.
Yeah, because it's awesome, because you can think of like, okay, like yes, like the reality, because the kingdom of God is a reality that he's speaking of, right? Of what life could be like. And it starts here. To go back to what we said earlier, the capacity for that reality begins within your being,
Yeah.
when with like again in the Christian tradition, with like the spirit of God like dwelling within your being and being to bring that about within you, right? That change. So just even like you just even see it in so many places that I guess if there's just, I mean, one thing we keep coming back to in this conversation is like, don't sell your agency like short, you know? And I think a lot of times we do.
Well, we don't know any better. We've been
Yeah.
taught to do
We,
that because that's the controlling factors of the
right.
world for eons. And they don't want us to have agency, because if we have agency, then we're going to take over the world. Well, guess what? People who have agency don't do that anyway,
Hmm.
right? It's like, I
No.
don't understand. Now, here, hold on a second. So, Jesus was not, I was raised Jewish.
Hmm.
And I've
Hmm.
been searching to try and understand all of this for my own understanding, right?
Hmm.
And the things that Like they didn't like Jesus while he was on the planet, or they wouldn't have
Hmm.
killed him.
Right, right, right.
Okay. However, what we're starting to see though, or when I started doing research on all of this stuff, I find, like you say, that radical part of him. First thing I found was the radical part where he would go back into the temples and it's in the Bible, in the Old
Hmm.
Testament. And I'm
Hmm.
not real versed on the Bible, but
Yeah.
I'm paying attention to some things. And he'd go back into the temples because, you know, the greed by the what do you call it? They weren't.
So like the Sadducees in the temple, the
That's
ones who are running the temple,
like
right?
the
The
priests,
priests. Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So the greed where like go out and kill all the animal, or we have a bunch of animals that here that you can sacrifice, but you can have a pigeon for
Hmm.
this amount of money because you can't
Right.
afford whatever, or you can have a goat or a lamb for this amount of money. So that's all about greed. And Jesus, when he went into the temple and he's like throwing tables and
Right, right, right.
can't do this and all this stuff. That's the Jesus I can wrap my head.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
now this part I don't know what you know because we've never had this, so I'm taking it
Yeah.
here. But the other piece of it is the I've been listening to some and reading some stuff about this, the 30-year empty space in the Bible of where Jesus was between the ages of 13 or whatever and or 18 and 30, 13 and 30. Nobody seems to know and nobody wants to talk
Right.
about that,
Right, right,
right?
right.
And there is proof out there that he was in Egypt, in India, in all. I've got a book called Autobiography of a Yogi,
Hmm.
Yogananda,
Hmm.
and he talks about Jesus in that book.
Mm.
And he wrote that book in the 30s or the 40s.
Hmm.
So and he talks about it the same way that you talk about it. So how does he know about Jesus in that way? When Jesus went to India, he learned from the yogis. So he knew how to do all these, miracles, so to speak. He learned how to create that miracle to bring it
Hmm.
back to uh, where he,
Yeah.
yeah.
That'd be interesting. I haven't read that. I'd have to look into that.
But even the
Yeah.
fact that you said that and you're open to it, I mean, that's the kind of thing that's important, is for us to be open to these old understandings and these old things that happen. Because if he was out there learning during that time and then coming back and then making everybody who didn't like that thought process mad enough to kill him, there's something to that, right?
Well, and what you see that Jesus does that's really awesome that we're covering, like especially in the last 75 years or so, last 80 years, is we've gotten back to really understanding Jesus in his Jewish context,
Yes.
which that's really important because for many centuries in church history, they tried to strip Jesus of his connection within Judaism, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And so now we actually have a whole plethora of knowledge that we have about what it means for Jesus to have been a Jew, to grow up as a Jew, and how he's not like, it's not like he's turning his back on the Jewish tradition, as many will say. What he's actually doing is he's weaving a very particular narrative and thread throughout
Yeah.
the Tanakh, right? Through the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, and he's weaving it through and he's bringing it all to its like conclusion, like to where it's all heading, right? So like you mentioned the temple earlier, like one example of that is like, okay, like the temple, it started with like the tabernacle and the temple, like that's where you go to meet God, right? And then now, like when you get to the New Testament, the understanding is like the temple is your body. Like the place now where you connect with God is not confined to a literal like geographic space. It now can go with you wherever you go, right? And that's something that the Old Testament actually talked about and said that that was going to happen, that God was going to give his spirit on people, right? Like that was all there, but Jesus is taking that thread and he's bringing it into reality, right? So like that's what for me, like just getting really geeky with it, but it's like that's what's exciting and awesome to see is like I think we're going, oh my gosh, like that makes so much sense. And now because I'm a big context guy, if you can't tell, like I want to understand like the context. Where do these things come from? Where do we come from, right? And
That's
so I think that's a part of this awakening too, is we are hungry to know like where
the
who
truth.
the origins, the truth, yeah. And so
So, what does awakening mean to you at this time on the planet? You kind of put it in a nutshell if you want to.
Yeah, I would say for me, for where I come from, it's an awakening to your story, that you have a story, that your story matters,
Mm,
that you can have agency in reauthoring your story. And then also an awakening that we are a part of a bigger story as well. The story of what it means to be human, the story of what it means to belong to God, right? Like we are awakening to this power of the story within and the story, the larger narrative that's out there,
mm,
and not having to settle for the narratives that are handed to us,
mhm.
that try to tell us who we are, that might be incomplete or just not true at all.
Exactly. And also just for understanding for some people, you could call
Yeah.
it mass consciousness to bring it in bringing it out, the story, bringing it out to everyone is that's the mass consciousness. So
Oh,
some,
I've never heard that
yeah,
term.
and it's beautiful
Yeah.
because when once 10% of us who are doing our healing work, when it
Hmm.
hits 10%, it seems to, it's like a number that will help expand it more exponentially into
Okay.
consciousness. So if we can get to the 10%, we should be okay. Right. Okay. Thank you for that. So the next question is, what is soul divinity to you
mm,
in relation to this awakening?
okay. So for me, again, speaking of my tradition and what I believe in, so the soul, like there's the Platonic idea of the soul, which is like just this thing that's like in you that goes somewhere like after you die, right? There's different ideas of the soul that exist. I am actually a big fan of the Jewish idea of the soul as your nephesh. That's what the Jewish term is for soul. And it's this idea of like your whole being, like, right? Like body, mind, spirit, like all of it, it converges and is united together. The spirit, your heart, those things that are like the core of who you are, right? The center of your being. You've got the mind, you've got your intellect, you've got your body where you enact these things out in the world, right? All of it together, like, is what makes up this idea, at least for me, of like the soul, right? It's the totality of everything of who we are. And
Mm,
then in terms of divinity, I believe that, I believe in God. I believe that God is real. I believe that God, through the human process of conception, like brings us into being. So the working of divinity and the human, like collaborating together, right? I think that's really beautiful. And I think like I believe that Jesus was that collaboration as well of that divinity and that humanity together. And then now I believe that we're empowered, despite whatever limitations we might have in our flesh and our being, that we have that ability as well, to connect with God in this level to where, I mean, people have different names for it, but basically where, as I believe that like Christ is like uh, he's not just God, but he's also like the ultimate human being. And so we as well, like the fact that God like has experienced being human, like relating to us, connecting with us in that way, for me is like that's like a game-changing thing because it's not just some spiritual thing out there
mm,
that I'm praying to. It's like this real, tangible, like God knows, right? So divinity for me is recognizing that and then recognizing also that I can be like Christ. I can live my life in such a way to where I reflect that love and that light to other people, wherever I go. And I know I'm not always going to get it right. I'm not going to be perfect, but it's believing that God never gives up on me and that God is working within me to bring about that so that ultimately, people can wake up.
are people out there who use this particular phrase,
Yeah.
and it relates back to the mass consciousness. And what they call it is Christ consciousness.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yep, that's
Is that
that's a
what you're
word I'm very
talking about?
familiar with as well. Uh-huh. Oh
Is
yeah.
that what you mean? Okay, because when you said that, I started hearing that in my head.
Yeah. I have different people I've encountered that use that term differently. So like I don't always use that term just because I don't kind of know sometimes what people mean by that. But I think based on what you're saying, like, yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
That's what it feels like to me when you're talking
Yeah.
about it. Yeah. Okay, so you've probably already said this already, but what is God or source?
Oh my gosh. That we need like out. Oh
No,
my
no,
God.
no, no. Just as soon as possible. I knew that was going to trigger something.
Yeah, I'm like, where, how much time we got for that one? Wow. That's a loaded
Yeah,
question.
I know. I know.
Yeah. Well,
You can sum it up in one word if you choose, because there is a word for that.
yeah. I mean, like, like God is love. Like, I think like that's like the most basic, and it even says that like there's even like that's like a direct like verse in the Bible too. It just says like straight up like God is love, right?
Yep.
Um, but I think we're on a journey as well. Like, no matter what tradition you're in, like, even if you're like in my tradition, if you're a Christian, sometimes we can get too settled on what God is, right? And we can think we have God all figured out. And we can think that, like, okay, sweet. And if we have God all figured out, then we probably haven't figured out God, right? Because
That's a good
God
point.
has to be
Yes.
so much bigger than us and
Right.
so much bigger than what our minds can even comprehend.
Yep.
So I think part of the journey that we're on as well is learning, right? So like for me, like the Bible, that's like the foundation of who God is, right?
Yep.
Is how God's revealed in there. And then I think the life that we live and the story that we're living out, we're continuing to learn who God is through the context of our lives and our experience, right? And so I mean, it's hard for me to give like a real like concrete answer,
Yeah.
other than God is love, and I think that Christ is the fullest embodiment of God that we've had, and the way where we see God, and now we're on a journey towards growing and learning
Yeah.
in that. So
Yeah. And what's interesting is there's been so many avatars out there as well as Jesus, who are embodiments of that as well in their faith, in these other faiths. So that's where the
yeah, because you're able to see as well, right? Like when you compare a lot of these different mythologies, you compare a lot of different religions,
Mhm.
a lot of different beliefs there, right? You start to see that, like, I call them like these echoes. Like
Yeah.
there's like these echoes of Christ that exist in them.
Yep.
And it's really fascinating, like to get to see where the overlap is, where those echoes are. And I think those conversations are worth having,
They are.
Again, like
Absolutely. That's
people might be listening and they might be turned off by the fact that I'm a Christian. But if we can learn to have a conversation and not run away, right? From when people have these different perspectives, because then we're able to go like what you brought up, like Christ consciousness, like what a beautiful like term, right? Like, like being able to understand and appreciate these different things and see
Mhm.
that we're on this journey together.
And here's two things I want to say about that. One,
Yeah.
you have a Jew and a Christian speaking right now, just saying, right? We're
Hmm.
having a conversation about this, and we're both fine, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. The second thing I wanted to bring goes back to what we were talking about, God or source, or what that means to you. In the Native American tradition, they call that God or source the great mystery,
Hmm.
which
Hmm. And
answers
I
the whole,
love that. And I love that.
right?
Oh
Yeah.
my
So
gosh.
there it is.
It is, well, yeah, it is the great mystery. I like,
We
you
don't
know,
know.
um, like even like one of the things I really appreciate is like, like the Tao. Um,
Yes. Thank you.
so like, like being able to see like, well, what is the Tao? Like C.S. Lewis wrote a book on this called The Abolition of Man. It's awesome. And it talks about like, well, what is the Tao, right? The Tao is like this logos. And what is the logos,
Are you
right?
talking about
And
the Dow, TAU?
yeah,
Or
it will, it could
T-A-O?
be
I'm
either
sorry,
Tao or
T-A-U,
Tao.
Dow?
Yeah.
It's okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So Tao, Tao, however you pronounce it there. But like even that's really fascinating, right? Is look at like what is this idea, this conception? And the
Yeah,
very first line, one of the very first lines in it is like, if you've completely like figured out the Tao, then it's not it.
exactly. Well, that's
You
life.
know,
That's life.
the great mystery.
That's the great
That's,
mystery. We
that's God.
know. No matter how much we think we know, we still don't know. That's what the
Right.
point of
We're,
education is.
yeah.
So, all right, let me get to the next question. Or you're right, we could be here all day. What is unconditional love?
Mm. I think that definition I gave earlier is a great example of it, that love is a commitment, be with someone for their betterment, right? I think that to me is, like the love that I have for my wife, the love that I have for my kids. That's like a very tangible way of me putting that. that unconditional love.
So let me ask you a question
Uh-huh.
on that.
Uh-huh.
What about the unconditional love for yourself? Because you did not say that in any of this part of the conversation. I'm
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I could give a ton of examples.
okay.
Yourself,
Yeah.
your neighbor. Like, I think that's all a part of it because you have to be able to give yourself grace, you
Yes.
know?
Yes.
And I think that's one of the hardest things for us to do as people is to forgive ourselves, to give ourselves grace, right? So that unconditional love. And I think, that's like the journey that I had to go on as well in a lot of ways, is like being okay with who I am,
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that if I love myself, then I'm ultimately going to work towards, being committed to growing, right? So apply that definition to yourself there, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think it works as well. I'm
Yes.
committed to my betterment, my personal development, my growth, um, because ultimately it's up to me. It's not up to anybody else.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. And by the way, I love your hair.
thank you. I have come to love it as well.
Good,
It
good.
took it
Because
took a long time.
my son, when he was little, his hair grew this way, and he has
Mhm.
figured out a way to do something with it that makes it look great too. And I'm like, I still love your hair.
We make the best with what we have.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, and this question is easy. How can people get in touch with you if they want
Yeah.
to know more about you?
So, a few different places. So, allthingsnarrative.com is my website where you can learn about my coaching workshops. You can learn about the class that I teach. You can find my podcast on there as well. So, my podcast is called Live a Meaningful Story because that's always my hope. And, excuse me, it's me and a group of friends. Really, we're really close, tight friends. And what we do is we talk about life, but we use films and movies
Mm,
in order to do that, right? We use stories because films are like a communal form of storytelling, right? We can all go see a movie, experience a story, and then we can experience things. We can
mhm,
talk about it, right?
mhm,
So
mhm.
it's kind of like a great entry point for talking about narrative and story and all these different things. But then also connecting that, not just seeing stories as something to consume passively, but how do we actually engage actively with stories? Because
Yes.
stories are doing a work on you, right? That's something that in the storytelling animal talks about is like it's almost like a spell in a way, it's
Oh
it's
yeah.
doing something in
Yeah.
you whether you realize it or not. So on my podcast, we're intentional about what it is, like having a discussion about what the stories are doing, how we're trying to make sense and navigate life through them, and
Yes.
exploring those connections.
That's
So
great. I love
you
that.
can find me through there, and then I'm also just on social media like Instagram,
Mhm.
LinkedIn, Facebook. Just you can find me at All Things Narrative. And if you listen to this episode and you really enjoy and you resonate with these things, like please feel free to reach out. Don't be a stranger. Never too busy for anyone.
Tell
So
your story.
yeah, yeah. I can't tell you how many
Because
people
it
will just be like,
matters. Yeah.
"Hey, can." And this is just a really beautiful thing is like this even happened last night. Is like there's something about wherever I go that like people have this sense that they can open up and tell me like their story. Sometimes I barely even
You're
say
an
anything,
empath.
right? Yeah, I think that's that's a huge part of it, right? Is people can pick up on those things.
Yes.
I can tell you how many
Hey,
people will just I had somebody who hit my car last week.
yes. Yeah.
So to bring it back full circle, I got in a car accident last week, but I didn't cause the car accident. Somebody else did, right? And they hit my car, and I don't care about that. Like it's just material, right? In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't even that bad, honestly. Like we didn't even do anything about it. But what I did care about was that we spent 45 minutes pulled over on the side of the road talking, sharing her
Nice.
story, right? And
Nice.
just
Yeah.
listening. And I was
Well, I'm
just
glad you're okay.
Oh yeah, I'm fine. But it's like that's like those God moments, right? Where I'm just like, oh my gosh, that happened. Like, thank you, God, for letting somebody hit my car today because I got to have this really authentic experience with a human being where
Isn't
we got to
it
connect.
interesting how our lives get weaved together like that?
Yeah,
I find that interesting. And
yeah,
all of his links and everything are going to be put in the description as well. So you'll be able to find it in there.
yeah.
Is there anything else you would like to add or share with our listeners before we go?
I'm wearing this shirt today. I'm living a story. I will not give up. And
Yes.
that is my hope and prayer for you out there
Yes.
is
Yes.
that you are living a story. Do not give up.
Do not give up. You're meant to
You
be
got
here.
this. You
You're
are
meant,
meant to be here. You are
yes,
here having a real, authentic human experience. Let's make the most of it
yes.
together.
Enjoy, enjoy. Thank you so much, Derrick. I really appreciate you. I mean, you're
Thank you, Caroline.
an incredible human being. And everyone, thank you so much for being here and watching Awakening Soul Divinity podcast. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you. Take care.